I'm Nick Amato, and I'm doing my chapter presentation on chapter 12, which is quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysis is different as opposed to qualitative analysis due to the fact that it relies more on surveying with numerical data as opposed to open-ended questions. So first, start off, let's talk about two different designs. You have the quasi design versus experimental design. An experimental design is when subjects are selected at complete random as a control group. So, for example, like if you were getting a population together, you would choose every other person, or you would have them choose a number and certain numbers get picked as the control and others get used as the variable. When a quasi design is used usually between two different groups. So one group is purposely exposed to a treatment or some sort of program, while the other is purposely is not. You use that to test the control variables between two different studies. When it comes to an analysis, to quickly break it down, you have a disaggregated analysis, which is usually used if there's a stratification in your samples. So it would be like different communities producing different type of crops, or urban communities of different economic levels. And it will ensure that all communities are adequately represented in the sample. Next is to test your hypothesis. So when you start your program, you have a hypothesis, which is a deductive approach based on a set about how communities or groups are likely to respond to program treatments. So you might want to, your programs often begin with a hypothesis about how a desired outcome might be achieved. So, for example, that education in rural areas might be improved by the use of interactive video programs. So that's your hypothesis. So that's what you base your program after. To test whether a program or intervention had an effect, the statistical analysis tests the null hypothesis, which is an evaluation cannot prove causality but only assess the probability that the observed relationship between the treatment and outcome could occur by chance if there was no association. So if there is a difference, you would reject your null hypothesis, because that would prove that there is some sort of association. And then the last type of analysis is a cost-benefit analysis, which assumes the economic rate of return and using it as a criteria of effectiveness. So if the money put in to this program was putting out the data you wanted, or the change that you found was significant. So one of the most important aspects of quantitative methods is the type of data collection that occurs. So particularly with quantitative, you want to be able to have something that has a very substantial numerical value as opposed to something that's very qualitative or is very open-ended. So one of the main focuses of data collection is going to be using questionnaires. And your types of questions could have classification questions. So if so like the sex, age, education, open-ended questions, which is more qualitative but can be used, and the closed questions, so questions like yes, no, lists, and then you can have category, which is ordinal. So someone who does something once a week, several times a week, 3 to 4 times a month. You can rank that, and you can put that into categories, into ordinal. You have ranking, which is a set of options based on importance. So that would include if you ranked the most important public service from firefighters to police in who you thought was the most important. And then intensity scales. So agree, strongly disagree on a level of 1 to 10. How do you feel about this? Those are all very good quantitative questions that can be asked. Then there's also interviewing, which is primarily used in qualitative analysis, just like open-ended questions are. The only difference is open-ended questions you can put some sort of numerical value to as long as you define the variables within the numerical or the open-ended question. So, and then there's observation, which, for example, if you want to observe some sort of indicators, so if a type of fast food restaurant is more prevalent in low income areas, that would be an observation. And then finally there's focus groups, which is a collection of people that have gone through the treatment and give details about how they feel about the treatment and their experiences, once again more qualitative than quantitative. Then there's secondary data collection, and this is kind of like what we've been doing in our research, and it comprises of surveys that have already been done. So like one real good example would be using the census as a line of baseline data. It can also be used for like exploratory studies, comparison. You could use it as your baseline data or even as your primary data if that you're not able to go out and collect data yourself. The only problem with that that data would be defined by a different set of variables, so it could screw with your research a little bit. So when it comes to the management of data, you want a clear definition of your objectives. Is it like exploratory data, or is it defining and testing a hypothesis? When it comes to data collection, a few problems that can arise is the sampling frame doesn't cover the correct population. So you're not asking the right people the right questions, there's no response, or if there's simply bad training within the collection process. So when it comes to data analysis, the first part is your descriptive data, which is your means, medians, and modes. You attain those as an initial understanding of characteristics of the population. And then that is also divided into nominal, ordinal, or interval variables. Ordinal being which order from first to last, interval being weight, age, and income, and nominals being given a set number, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So once you've collected your variables, ordinal, interval, or nominal, you'd have the second dispersion, where you would find the range, which is the difference between the highest and lowest value, the standard deviation, which is the difference between each value and the mean. So one of the if the mean income of a group of people was $350, the standard deviation was 25, then because of the way the standard deviation works, 65% of families would fall within $325 or $375 as a daily income. And then if you go outside of that, 95% of the families would fall within it. would fall within $300 and $400 of the standard income. So it's a way to test the difference between different yeah. Then the next what you have is the z-score, which the deviation can be standardized into a score, and then the value of that standard deviation can be compared for populations with different means. When it comes to testing two groups, the most common way to do that is using the t-test. And the t-test compares one moment. So when it comes to the t-test, you can do a single sample, dependent means, or independent means. When you use a single sample, it would be like the total population of the interest. For example, all children attending secondary school in a particular region. A t-test for dependent means is a comparison of mean score for the project group at 2 points in time. So this you would use to compare you can use the same group and use their t-scores previously and then post, and that would you would see the difference in the means and if the program or treatment was effective. This is usually found in quasi-experimental forms. And then when you use independent, that is a comparison in group selected to be representative of the total population of interest. Finally, you have your cross tabulations, which compare nominal outcomes. You would use the chi-squared test normally for the cross tabulations. So this is used to compare two ordinal groups. So one, for example, would be if you're comparing the way children react to getting a free lunch at school. Would they eat it there? Do they save it later and take it home? Do they not take it? And so you would use either if it was a male-headed household or female-headed household, single parent household. Those are all different categories. And you would use the chi-squared to compare those different categories to see if there's a goodness of fit between the two categories. Multiple regression then is used to assess whether there's still a significant difference after controlling for key household characteristics. So if you're analyzing if there are differences in the change in household incomes between the project and comparison groups over 3 years, your analysis would control for the years of education of the household head, the amount of land owned by the household head at the start of project, and the number of dependent children. So by controlling for all three, you're able to see if there's still a relationship that can be found using a t-test. So that's a rundown of chapter 13. I know it's fairly long, and I know there's a lot more we could probably get to, but for the most part, from what we're doing, what it comes down to is understanding the difference in designs and when to run a t-test or a z-test, and it mainly breaks down into if you're running for two groups or a single group and what you're trying to compare. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy this video.